Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. All right, we're going to start today, as we like to start, first by giving some tzedakah. I'd like to invite everybody to give some tzedakah if you have a tzedakah box. If you'd like to give, there's a virtual tzedakah box online and on the chat room that you can click and give tzedakah there. And just to mention to people that this coming Wednesday night and Thursday is the 3rd of Tammuz, which is the Rebbe's yahrzeit, the anniversary of the Rebbe's passing. It's customary on that day to mention, to ask for blessings at the Rebbe's grave and to mention your name and your mother's name. So I would like to encourage you, if you'd like, there's an email address in the chat room, ohel@ohel.org, if you'd like to send it to there, or you can send me your name and your mother's name, and then I will be happy to forward it for you to the Ohel. Okay, let's get started. Once again, welcome everybody, and I want to welcome our special guest, Shoshana Chaya. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I need you to unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you.
So you're not in Jerusalem, and you're not sitting by the wall. Where are you right now?
I'm actually in Madison, Wisconsin. I love this background. I love the hotel. I love being there. So I use it as my background.
All right. So let's start from the beginning. Tell us, where were you born and where did you grow up?
Wow. Okay. I was born in Nigeria. And
Which city in Nigeria?
Oh gosh, I was born in a tiny city called Enugu. You can really call it a city at the time. It was a town. It's called Enugu. It's in the east of Nigeria. Mm-hmm. And we moved around Nigeria a little bit, but I lived in the eastern part of Nigeria until I was 11 years old, when the Civil War broke out. The Civil War broke out actually when I was 9, but when I was 11, I got to leave Nigeria. So I was in Nigeria until I was 11, and then I went to Holland, where my father and his family were living at the time.
I see. In Holland, where in Holland?
In The Hague. My father was involved in the diplomatic corps. And the reason that I actually ended up living in Nigeria living in Holland was because he was very worried about my education, about me not getting an education during the Civil War. So he did everything he could to get me out of the country. Now, I don't know that there are people old enough to remember the period in history that I'm talking about, but it was in the late 60s, and there was a war being fought in Nigeria. It was a genocidal war. It was called the Nigeria-Biafra War, and people outside of Nigeria heard about it, primarily because it was one of the first wars that they fought in Africa, where starvation was considered to be a legitimate instrument of war, and millions of babies were starved to death. And so when people hear about Biafra, they typically equate it with starvation, because that was what they heard about. So with all that going on, my father was very, very keen that I got out, and he did everything he could to get me out. He succeeded. I actually left the country in a huge cargo plane that was really primarily for bringing relief food. And so the rest is history, really.
Wow. Tell me, your parents were separated, or what? Your mother was in Nigeria?
Yeah.
And your father? Uh-huh.
Yeah, my parents were separated. Well, probably divorced, actually. I didn't know that they were formally divorced, but for sure they were separated. I think, as the story goes, and I don't really know what actually happened, but my mother had some mental health issues at the time and suffered a near complete breakdown after I was born, and was deemed unable to look after me. So I had to go and live with some other relatives of my dad, and he kind of continued his life because he didn't really feel that he was in a position to take care of a little girl. I mean, I had other brothers before me, and they were all sent to various boarding schools in England. So he sent me to a family that he was related to, that had kids of their own, to kind of take care of me. And people did that in Africa at the time. People would often send their kids to other people who were better suited to take care of them. And so he was completely financially responsible for me, in the sense that he paid for my education and my clothing and so on and so forth. But I lived with these relatives of his, and their children. So that's how that happened.
Can you describe what life was like growing up as a kid?
It was
war and everything, all the difficulties.
Well, it was certainly for me as a child. It was very, very strange, because I was aware. I mean, I started my life when I was, say, I think 14 months old or 18 months old. I was taken to go and live with my grandmother before I was moved to these people that I end up living with. And so I was very aware that I wasn't where I belonged, that I was not at home, and I always experienced this feeling of displacement. Now, there are interesting experiences that I had growing up as a kid, but the one that really stands out is that, the relatives of my dad that I was living with were very, 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 very staunch Catholics. And they tried to bring me up in the Catholic tradition. And when I was about 3 years old, I would say I actually experienced a crisis of faith, in the sense that, well, they had this beautiful house, and within the house they had a chapel, which was like a little church that was inside their house. And priests would come and, say mass and do services in this chapel that they had. And we had to learn something called catechism, which was basically the theological background of Catholicism. We had to start learning this very, very early on. And I remember going into the chapel one day, trying to really understand what I was being taught. And I was looking at now I don't know if anybody here is familiar at all with Catholicism, but if you've been to Jerusalem, you would have seen a street called Via Dolorosa. And right. Every Catholic church has a mini version of that. And they have things called Stations of the Cross, which basically details JC's suffering and, crucifixion. And as a good Catholic, you're supposed to believe that this was done for your salvation, and that this was a necessary part of redemption. Anyway, I was in this chapel looking at all these really horrific pictures of, a suffering, bleeding man. And I could not reconcile that in my mind as something that was fair or something that I should aspire to. And so that was my earliest crisis of faith, as it were. And there was nothing in me that could really embrace that as having any meaning in my life. And I would say that from that moment on, I was no longer a Catholic. And the rest of my life was really spent in this kind of existential crisis and trying to understand who I was and what the purpose of my life was.
So everyone around you was Catholic. The people who were raising you were Catholic.
Yes.
And you had this issue with Catholicism. Did you have any kind of support? Were you able to discuss it with anybody?
No, because I did ask a question one time, and I wanted to understand why all the suffering was necessary, and why, if going to hell was built into the plan, why I was created. And I was told it was a mystery and that we didn't question these things, and I never questioned after that. So there wasn't really anybody I could talk to, because I also ran the risk of ending up in hell if I questioned too much or expressed doubts. And you have to bear in mind, I was 3 years old, so I was very easy to frighten.
Wow. Otherwise, besides this religious existential problem or a crisis, whatever, how was economically, and were you okay? And was the war, did you feel the effects of the war where you were?
Well, economically, we were fine, simply because, I lived with people who, were in the kind of upper echelon of society. The war didn't actually break out until I was 9. I think the war started in 1967. And everything changed. We had a lot of air raids, there were a lot of refugees. We experienced the effects of not being able to buy the food that we wanted, of not having salt in our food, of being afraid every time because of the air raids. I saw dead bodies for the first time because after every air raid, people would come in and start digging up the rubble of the destroyed buildings. And I remember very clearly one day that we had gone to the market and there was an air raid. And it was the first time that we were outside of the house when an air raid happened. And it was very, very, very frightening. And of course, a lot of buildings were destroyed. And as soon as the air raid was over, the men came in and started digging up, hoping to find survivors. And they dug up this little boy. I can still see him. He was wearing a red shirt and he was dead. And that was my first experience of actually seeing a corpse. So it wasn't a great time to be around because we were always afraid. And I had a lot of experiences myself of being outside when an air raid happened. And there was one particular incident where I was coming back from somewhere and I ran into a man who looked just like a skeleton. And I was really deathly afraid, and he was just really, really dark. His eyes were sunken and he looked just like a skeleton. And I thought I was seeing a ghost. And he comes up to me and he looks me in the eye and he calls my name. And I suddenly realized that this was my 3rd grade teacher. And he said to me, "Tell your father that I'm dying of hunger." And I still remember the helplessness I felt and just that sense of injustice, that this is not right. And I didn't really have a spiritual recourse because it was really evident to me at the time that I couldn't really rely on God to help me, because the demands of Catholicism were so incredibly huge. So yeah, that was, in a nutshell.
So then you moved to, I wanted to ask you, did you have siblings? Like, were they siblings with you or?
I had siblings, but what my father typically did, I had brothers I was the only daughter of my mother. And what my father typically did was when any of my brothers came of age, when I say came of age, when they were like 5 or 6, he would send them to boarding schools in England because he himself had an extensive education in England, and he really believed that the British had the best educational system. So, and the boarding school system in England, he thought was, a really great thing. So he would send my brothers to boarding school. So yes, I had siblings, and I saw them once in a while when they came back. And this is before the war, when they came back, but I didn't really grow up with them.
So then you went to Holland, and what happened when you went to Holland?
Well, I was enrolled at the British School in The Hague in Holland, and what I discovered, and this is kind of an after thing, was that all my best friends were Jewish, and I felt this incredible affinity with Jewish people, although I didn't really know what that was or why. I mean, when I found out I was Jewish, I could explain it, but at that point, it didn't seem particularly peculiar. It just was the way things were. Right. So, yeah.
Okay, and then you went to high school there, and then tell me about your journey toward Judaism. What happened that you found out that you were Jewish?
Well, I didn't actually find out I was Jewish until I returned to Nigeria after we lived in Holland. I was 19 years old, and I had gone to visit my mother and my grandmother. And my grandmother really made a big thing about being a Christian mother, and she always used to go to these Christian mothers meetings. And anyway, long story short, one day she was getting ready to go to one of her meetings, and I was there. I think I'd come from university, and I'd just come to visit them. And she said, "Oh, by the way, you do know we're Jewish, don't you?" And no, I didn't know we were Jewish. I said, but you don't have to worry about it. Don't worry about it because we're Christians. So it's okay. Don't worry about it. We're Christians now. And she really changed the subject. And at that time, it didn't have a huge impact on me. I mean, she could have said, you realize you're from Outer Mongolia, and it would have had exactly the same effect. It didn't really have any meaning because I never really knew that there was even a credible spiritual path that could resolve my existential crisis. So it didn't seem to offer me anything. I mean, she could have told me that, her parents landed from the moon and it would have had exactly the same effect. It was only after I moved from Nigeria to England that I became aware of my need to find meaning in my life. And I'm writing a book about all of this, and it's kind of very difficult to sort out the wheat from the chaff. So I'm going to rely on you to ask me, specific questions that you want answers to.
Right. This is all fascinating. But as a teenager in Holland, you had a lot of Jewish friends, but somehow didn't connect to what it meant to be Jewish, or
right, because they weren't particularly connected to Judaism. That's the thing. Like, it wasn't a thing. And the British school that I went to in Holland was really an international school. Religion was not taught. And, we knew that there were various religions in the world. Judaism never really came up as one of the religions. And it had been mentioned that there were things like Buddhism and Hinduism, but there was never really any kind of religious or even philosophical education. So it never came up. All I knew was that I didn't want to be religious, and I didn't want to have anything to do with what Catholicism represented. But in terms of what else there was, I had absolutely no idea.
Okay, so now tell me how that progressed and how that changed and how you got involved in Jewish life. But I'd like to hear a little bit about that journey from not meaning anything to you to the point where you started getting involved.
Well, actually, okay, the very, very, very short version of this is that I met somebody who actually happened to be Jewish, this girl, and we became very good friends because we worked in the same place. And she said to me, "Oh, I'm seeing this person who was a therapist." And she's very good. It was an Israeli psychotherapist that she was seeing at the time. So though she's very, very good, you should see her too, she says to me. And I said, "Well, I don't need therapy." She goes, "Oh, yeah, you do." So anyway, I signed up. I called this woman, and she really was an extraordinary individual. And I remember thinking, okay, you're going to solve my problem. How long is it going to be before I'm completely healed and don't have any problems anymore? And she said, "Oh, no, that just never happens. You're in this for life." So anyway, she was really great. But what she did do was turn me in a spiritual direction and enabled me to see, because of all the holistic therapies that she was offering, that there was a credible spiritual path that gave meaning. Now, she did not present Judaism as that. What she did was to hand me a volume, a huge book called A Course in Miracles. And she said, "Take this, read the introduction, and then, come back and let's talk about it." And so fast forward, when I actually ended up buying this book for myself, I also bought a book that introduced me to Kabbalah. And these two things kind of happened concurrently in my life. And as I became more focused on spiritual practice, my life changed more and more, but the questioning grew. It didn't get any less. It got bigger, because I could see that Kabbalah was offering me something, and I just didn't seem to have any access into it. So that's, the kind of...
Okay, so So how did you pursue that? I mean, how did you get connected? Did you reach out to, you were in England at this time. We're in England, and did you find a community? How did you get involved in the community? How did you get your questions answered?
I did not get involved with Judaism. I mean, my friend who introduced me to the therapist was a very good friend of mine, and we both did A Course in Miracles together, and we meditated a lot. All the people, by the way, who were kind of the proponents of the Course in Miracles, who authored it, who talked about it, who taught it, every single one of them was Jewish. And that I didn't fail to notice that. That was very obvious to me at the time. And so what I did was pursue the mind training program of A Course in Miracles, hoping that it would open up Kabbalah for me. And that's actually how I ended up in the United States. And that was
okay. So I'm going to get back to that. I want to continue that story, but first, I'm sure everybody wants to know. Yes. Tell me about your mother and your grandmother. They were Christian. They were in Nigeria. I assume that they were Black.
They were, well, yeah. I mean, my great grandmother probably was of mixed extraction, but yeah.
So where did that come from? Where did your lineage, Jewish lineage, come from?
Oh, apparently, and this is what I found out, because, you know, by the time I was ready to start looking at all of this, my grandmother had passed away, and I had some cousins. Apparently, they were from North Africa, and apparently they belonged to a blacksmithing family. How they ended up in Nigeria is simply a matter of speculation at this point, because I don't have any records, and I'm still kind of trying to investigate that and discover it. What I did do was talk to a cousin of mine who had lived with my grandmother's mother when she was a kid. And she assured me that my great-grandmother would never allow herself to become converted or, influenced to become a Christian. And I asked about certain practices that she had. And, you know, she had the kind of family purity practices, the way she used to pray in the morning, the way she washed herself, and so on and so forth. And so although this cousin of mine, who is now in her 70s, does not remember a lot of specifics, she remembers enough to convince me that my grandmother wasn't just pulling an idea out of her hat, that we really were actually Jewish.
Mm-hmm. Well, but you did end up actually going through a conversion.
Absolutely. I mean, I had to, because what happened was, as I was looking at how to get into, because one thing became very clear to me, there was really no path into Kabbalah except through Torah. And I just really needed to know, for my own edification, I wanted to know what it meant to be Jewish and how to live as a Jew. And one of the things I really wanted to do was to go to Israel. And I felt that Israel would provide answers. Mm-hmm. And I was very, very, very emotionally moved the first time I arrived in Israel. And I've been going back to Israel ever since, and going and doing all kinds of learning. But I spoke to 2 or 3 different people, one rabbi, before I went to Israel, and I said, my grandmother tells me I'm Jewish. I know I'm Jewish. What do I have to do? And he said to me, if your grandmother is Jewish, that means your mother's Jewish. Why do you have to do anything? And so I guess I wasn't really asking the right question. When I got to Israel, I was introduced to a rabbi in Yerushalayim, and I went and spoke with him. And I said, I want you to recommend a school or a learning program that I can enroll in to learn how to live as a Jew, to learn what it's really all about. Because wherever I look, I'm inexorably drawn back to Judaism, and I want to know what to do. I just don't even know how to gain access into this. And so he talked to me a little bit about my family history, and he said, listen, I have a lot of issues right now with people from all over Eastern Europe, and any school I can send you to will demand proof that you are Jewish. Mm-hmm. And you're welcome to go and look for that proof. You're welcome to go and start looking for death records and burial records and so on and so forth. And, you may come up with answers, you may not. But honestly, what I would recommend and what I advise you to do is to go through a process of formal Orthodox conversion to Judaism. And he said, I promise you, you will learn more doing that than you could possibly learn from any school that I would send you to. And this was music to my ears because I didn't need to prove to anybody that I was Jewish. I already knew I was Jewish. I just wanted to know what to do, what the steps were that I should take. And so he told me exactly what to do. So I came back and I spoke to our Chabad Rabbi over here that you know very well. And he said, well, you need to go to the Beit Din, the Chicago Rabbinical Council was kind of the one that was closest to us. And you need to contact them, which I did. And they gave me a long interview and welcomed me with open arms and said, okay, now, so here is a bunch of books you have to read. And they gave me a list as long as my body of books that I had to read. And I'm extraordinarily grateful that they did that, because what actually transpired in the process was that not only did I learn what I was supposed to do, it also put me in touch with our Chabad Rabbi and the Rebbetzin, both of whom you know extremely well. And they really
sister-in-law, yeah.
Yes, and they opened their hearts and home to me, and I spent all the Shabbos and all the holidays with them. At that point, I didn't live in Madison. I lived 40 miles away, and it was really important. And the Beit Din had also made it very clear that I actually needed to live within walking distance of the shul. So as soon as I could, I moved to Madison. I'm now closer to the shul, actually, than anybody else. But what this process of conversion does and did is that it really enabled me to reap the benefits of an authentic Jewish way of life. And yeah, it's absolutely.
How long did that process take? The conversion process, from when you decided that you wanted to actually do the conversion until you actually went to the mikveh for the conversion?
Well, we're not allowed to go to the mikveh yet, so I'm still waiting for them to open the mikveh. So in that sense, the conversion process is still going on. It's like a never-ending process. So the actual dunking in the mikveh, that hasn't occurred yet because, thank you, COVID, So that's kind of where we're at with it.
So how long has it been since you consider yourself to be an observant Jew?
Well, I would say that I considered myself to be an observant Jew actually from the moment that I spoke with the rabbis in Israel. Now, as an observant Jew, and when I say observant Jew, I mean living a God-centered life in a Jewish way. Mm-hmm. But in terms of living a God-centered life, that has been going on really for the last 30-something odd years.
Right. So you went from Nigeria to Holland and back to Nigeria, and then you went to England.
England. Well, went from Nigeria to Holland, back to Nigeria, then to Germany for a year, then to England, then to South Africa for a year, then back to England, then the United States. So there's been a lot of traveling.
So what brought you to the United States?
A Course in Miracles, the spiritual program that I was involved in. That's really the reason I came here.
I see. So that program was centered here, and you came here for that.
It's actually not centered in the U.S. It came out of the United States, but it wasn't centered in the U.S. It's all over the world. It's in 50 different languages, including Hebrew, or 30 different languages, including Hebrew. But there was a teacher and a group here in Wisconsin with whom I resonated intensely.
I'm going to ask you I'm not sure of the philosophical, spiritual question.
Yeah.
Can you, looking back at this whole journey, what do you think drove you toward Judaism?
Honestly, I would say that there, okay, I don't know Yiddish, but there's an expression called pinktele Yid, I think is what the
Mentally,
expression
right.
is. And I really do, and I can speak from my own experiences, that there is such a thing as a Jewish soul. And it doesn't matter how far and wide you travel, it will draw you, because the force that propelled me or compelled me or impelled me is a force that really has nothing to do with the circumstances. And I can really see, looking back, that that is something that has been in operation since I was a very young child.
Mhm. What are you doing now in Madison besides studying Torah?
Well, that's pretty much all I do. But I volunteer and I do crisis counseling. But pretty much studying Torah, I mean, this is one of the benefits, if you can call it that, of this whole lockdown situation, is that all of a sudden we have access to learning on tap, and it's just absolutely amazing. And so that's what I do. And when I can, I go to Israel. So far, I've been lucky enough to go once or twice a year and enroll in a course of study at Malchus, which is a small seminary for women of all ages that is kind of ensconced.
Where is that? Where is that?
It's right at the border of Mea Shearim. It's in Yerushalayim. And there's actually a seminary for girls called Or Chaya. And Malchus is run by Rabbi Appel and his wife, and they just make Hasidus learning accessible and available to women of all ages. And we have amazing rabbis and rebbitzins that teach there, and the quality of education is phenomenally high.
Now I have a few questions about the impact of your journey on your family. First of all, let's talk about your family. How do they feel about you becoming Jewish and about your journey?
Well, interestingly enough, from my mother, I have 3 brothers. And my second oldest brother said, when I spoke to him about it, said, I've always known that we were Jewish. And it turns out that he taught himself Hebrew, lived for the longest time as a Torah observant Jew. And for years and years and years. And he said, well, I've always known that. Now, he doesn't recall how he discovered. He doesn't know if somebody told him. But certainly for as long as he can remember, he's known that we were Jewish and that my mother was Jewish. He's always known that.
And how do your parents feel about it?
Well, both my parents are not, I mean, they're gone, they're long gone.
Okay.
So I don't know. My mother, I never really was able, because of her mental state, I never really was able to have a conversation with her. I mean, they said she suffered from chronic schizophrenia, but really she didn't engage, she didn't interact socially. She did when I was a very, very young child, but certainly when I saw her as an adult, she really didn't seem to know who I was.
Did you experience any racism, either growing up, going to Holland, or as becoming a Jew in the Jewish community, or has race affected your journey at all?
I would have to say no. Race has not affected my journey in any way. I've lived, I mean, the cumulative amount of time I spent in Nigeria in my entire life is about 15 years. And I'm 62 now. So I've lived for 47 years outside of Nigeria. And in most of the communities, in fact, all of the communities, I've always been in the minority. Like I was the only Black person in my school for the longest time, the only Black person, it's always that way. And I cannot really say that I've had an incident where somebody has been mean to me or been impolite because I was of a different race. That has never happened. And I chalk that up to the fact that race for me growing up was never an issue. My oldest brother, my half brother, is biracial. And so it's never been a thing. Now, whether it's that I haven't noticed or that, I simply have been very lucky, I am aware of the idea of racism. But when I'm in an all-black country like Nigeria, then it's tribalism, or it's this ism or that ism. So prejudice and marginalization of people considered weaker or poorer has literally just been the way that human beings seem to conduct their life. And I cannot say, honestly, now it's perfectly possible that things have happened because of racism, but I just haven't noticed. But no, it really has not been an issue for me. And certainly what I've learned is that there is a huge degree of honesty that is personally required for the individual to grow. And everybody is under the same mandate to grow and transform as human beings.
I'm going to invite people to ask questions, and if you'd like to, you can either put a question in the chat, and I will go through them as they were asked. But before that, I'd like to ask you to address the elephant in the room. What is your feeling about what's going on now with the race relations in America?
Well, honestly, I really think it's been politicized. Certainly, I think we can all agree, no matter where we come from. And I've seen police brutality. I've seen more police brutality, actually, in Nigeria than I have in any other country. I think we can all agree that police brutality is just a horribly evil thing that does not belong in the civilized society, period. I don't think it has to do with race. I think that the idea of uniformed people abusing their power is a horrible idea. And it's one that we really should work very hard to undo, for sure. But this whole thing about systemic racism, I don't buy it, because number one, that's not my experience. Number two, because there are enough Black people in America who are able to transform their disadvantages into advantages. There are enough witnesses to the fact, to the truth, that if you are honest and you work on yourself and you strive for higher good, that, higher good does come to you. So I just don't buy it. I'm particularly disgusted by all the looting and rioting and, all the anger, the justifiable anger. I don't think anger is justifiable. I don't think basing your actions on a negative emotion is a wise thing to do, regardless of what color you are. And I think that if you look at the countries where you take the white person out of the equation, if you look at the countries that that where everybody is Black, we're not faring any better. The corruption and the abuse and it's just awful. And so what I really feel as a Black person, I feel this very strongly, that the best thing that we can do as a people is to be really honest about just the horrors and the negativity that we tolerate in ourselves, and strive to get better for ourselves. I mean, it's not really about proving it to anybody else. It's just that, you have to be a mensch. It's just the way it works. It doesn't work any other way, and that's the bottom line for me.
Just one more question on that, and that is, as a Black Jew.
Yes.
So what can you tell me about Black Jewish relations? We talked about this the other day. I'm interested to hear how you feel about Black Jewish relations.
Yeah, it's very interesting, actually, because in the United States, there is a Jewish stereotype, and you're supposed to look a certain way if you are Jewish. So if you don't look that way, people will ask you questions like, well, how are you Jewish? And somebody asked me that once, and I said, well, I'm Jewish because my mother's Jewish. How are you Jewish? But it's this idea that if you are Jewish, that you have to look a certain way. Now, that's only for people who don't really know what it means to be a Jew. I don't run into that in Israel. And I remember talking to a friend of mine about the conversion process and what an extraordinarily amazing process I think it is. And she said, they're making you go through a conversion? Are they doing that because you're Black? So that had never really occurred to me. I mean, there is something called halakha, and there's a process, and I didn't think it would really matter what color you are. And then, of course, I ran into other people who have an organization. It's a friendship society of, Blacks and Jews, and I actually did find that incomprehensible, because I say, you're really creating two discrete groups that don't exist as discrete groups. What's there to say that you can't be Jewish and Black? In terms of, I've run into questions based on ignorance of Judaism, but in terms of segregation or racism, I'm still, Bezrat Hashem, I'll never encounter it, but for sure, for now, I haven't encountered it.
Amen. I'm going to go through a few questions that were asked here. And again, anyone who would like to post a question on the chat. The first question that was asked, and I'm just going to read it as it is. Can Jewish followers also practice Buddhism?
Why are you asking me?
That's a question right there on Facebook. I'm just passing it on to you.
Anybody can do whatever they want. I'm not an expert on Buddhism. So, but certainly I know vaguely what Buddhists represent. I think that what you will find in trying to follow a different direction from the one of your soul is that all of these ideas, the best ideas in terms of human development, in terms of personal development and finding meaning and finding deep, deep joy and connection with the Creator, all of that is already in Judaism. And certainly you can wander away from Judaism, but you will come back, because truth is true and nothing else is true.
Someone asked, you kind of addressed it, with whom did you study Torah? Can you be a little bit more specific about whom you study Torah with?
With whom I study Torah? Well, I study Torah with my rabbi over here. He teaches Torah with the Rebbetzin. She also teaches Torah.
Rabbi Matasov and Rebbetzin Matasov, who run the Chabad house in Madison, Wisconsin.
Absolutely.
Dina's sister and my brother-in-law, yeah.
Yes. Okay. And a variety of rabbis. Like right now we're doing a class with Rabbi Silverstein in New York somewhere. He teaches Tanya. There are various rabbis. I have a whole list of them. I think there's Yaakov Cohen, who also teaches Torah. There's so many of them. And of course,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I still attend remote classes. There's Mrs. Wisniewski, Yehudis Wisniewski. Her husband is Moshe Wisniewski. I don't know if you know him. He does a lot of the translations for the Chabad books. And she does a 3-hour, 4-hour class every Thursday on various aspects of Torah. Like right now, we are working with Likutei Torah and Torah or of the Alter Rebbe. Phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. So
and you also recently started learning with some rabbi in Palo Alto, I noticed.
Yes.
That's how we met. That's how we met. You joined my classes. All right. That's very impressive. All right. What's your educational background and work experience in the world in general?
Yikes. Okay. So I have a degree in French and German. I have like an associate degree in something called hypnoprimary therapy, which was developed by a Cambridge psychologist called Glenn Seaborn Jones. He's passed away now. And it's kind of based on Ericksonian hypnotherapy and primal therapy of Arthur Yanov. And of course, as I said, for the last 20-something years, I've been very, very deeply steeped in the mind training of A Course in Miracles, which is a spiritual development program.
That's the only things that I know.
That's great. Okay. When and why did you become a vegan?
Gosh, okay, so I actually started a plant-based diet in the 1980s, I think in the late 80s or early 90s. I read a book at that time by Harvey and Marilyn Diamond called Fit for Life, and they broke down exactly what happens in the body with the consumption of meat and dairy products. And so that was enough to convince me that meat and dairy products did not belong in my system. So I quit eating meat and dairy products. And that went on for a very long time. When I got involved in the Course in Miracles, it was again restated that not only was meat unhealthy, that I was actually imbibing or taking into my system all the fear and suffering that the animal underwent in slaughter, and that, it didn't belong in my system. It was fine because I wasn't even eating meat at that point, but that was a further reason not to. And sometime I think around 2006, about 2005, 2006, I had an experience actually of being, and it was just one of these kind of altered state experiences. I'd done a 30-day water fast. And if you've ever done a water fast that long, you know that after a while, you do go into an altered state. Anyway, so I got into this altered state, and I found myself sitting at what looked like a table of me and anthropologists, back in the turn of the 20th century. And the conversation that was being had on this table and what they were trying to determine was whether the Black African, the Negroid African, was actually human or not. And how they were going to treat the Black African literally depended on what conclusion they came to. And they came to the conclusion that he wasn't actually quite human. He wasn't totally ape, but he was somehow kind of just in between. And so you could purchase him as, property. You could kill him if you felt like it. You could treat him the way that you would treat your farm animal. And that was the conclusion they reached, because they were Christians, and the Christian religion didn't really allow them to just kill people or own people. So it was kind of a happy medium that they came to. Now, this was all going on in this kind of altered state experience I had. But what it did to me was, oh my goodness, this is how we treat animals. I don't think anything of buying a pair of leather shoes. I don't think anything of buying, a down-filled duvet or wearing a woolen jacket. And in that moment, just based on that experience and that experience alone, I was no longer willing to participate in anything that involved the humiliation and the exploitation or the killing of animals. And that was, 2005, 2006, 14 years ago? I don't know how, yeah.
Someone asked how I know Shoshana. I just mentioned that you started joining my classes. What was the hardest part about Judaism for you?
I think the hardest part for me was, it seemed for a moment, and it was only for a brief moment, it seemed to be really regimented. And, I had to do things in a particular way. And I will use, for instance, davening in the morning.
Right.
I had a sitter, and the prayers were worded in particular ways that I wouldn't necessarily have worded them myself. And so to me, that was actually the biggest struggle, until something happened where I realized that when I was davening, it was me. I was talking. I was expressing my heart's desires. It wasn't something that was being done to me. And so it was just this incredible turnaround. And it's really by divine grace, because it wasn't something that, I contrived. It literally happened, and it completely changed my experiences totally. And the other thing I struggled with was the idea of having to eat a set number of meals, over Shabbos. So that was a thing. And so I immediately gained 10 pounds until I figured out how to do it. So, yeah.
Are you in touch with other Jewish communities in Nigeria? Someone is saying here, I've heard that the Igbo people are descendants of ancient Hebrews.
You know what? I've heard that too. I'm not actually in touch with any. I'm not really in touch with people in Nigeria. I mean, and that's not because there's anything wrong with being in touch with people in Nigeria. It's just I haven't really kept in touch with people in Nigeria. And so I'm not really familiar with any of the Jewish communities in Nigeria. I've heard about them. And in fact, the last time I was in Nigeria, I was doing some, NGO social development work for a cousin of mine. And one of the places that they had an office was a place called Umweri, which means the children of Eri. And I thought, that's interesting, because the Eri people have always insisted that they got that name because they were descended from Eri, who was one of the grandchildren of Yaakov Avinu. But I didn't meet anybody who was professing Judaism or, who was an observant Jew while I was in Nigeria.
I have a question from Facebook. A couple of people are asking, can you tell us, were you ever married?
Yeah, I was. I've been married twice, I think, yes, and divorced both times. And I don't have to wear a head covering because neither of the men was Jewish.
All right, but you're not married right now.
I'm not married right now. No. And I don't have any kids.
Did you ever find out why your grandmother left Judaism and became a Christian?
I think it was, I didn't find out specifically why she did. Apparently, it didn't actually happen until she was in her teenage years. But I think everybody was becoming a Christian because there was a kind of a missionary mandate to convert everybody to Christianity. And so that was just, and I think at that time, to go to a school or to really do anything, you had to be baptized in the Catholic Church and be educated as a Christian. So, and I know that after they became Christians, both she and my great uncle tried to convert my great grandmother, and she wasn't having it.
Mm-hmm. Wow. How did you get the name Shoshana Chaya? I guess your original name is Jubilee, and where did you get the name?
Susanna is my middle name.
Susanna. Okay.
And the Hebrew version of that is Shoshana, and so that's how that came about. And it was actually interesting because one of the names I was given at birth was Florence, and I opened a book of letters to the Rabbi one time, and somebody was asking what Jewish name they should choose, and the Rabbi actually said that people called Florence should be called Shoshana, but I was already called Shoshana before then. I just thought, wow, that's really interesting. Interesting,
yes.
Yeah.
You seem to have a real connection there. Okay.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
You consider yourself a feminist? I'm reading. Do you consider yourself a feminist Orthodox woman? How do you reconcile a male-dominated stance, influence, and viewpoint? Are you trying, by the way, I'm reading this.
Yeah, I see that.
Are you trying to change or explore things for a more equal stance or awareness?
Well, but this is one of the questions that are just, certain things pose as questions, but they're just statements. And those statements are not necessarily accurate statements. I mean, there are a lot of statements and there are a lot of assumptions that are made in that question.
I just want to tell you something.
Yeah.
Before you go on.
Yeah.
That is the best response I've ever heard to a question like that. Please go on.
Oh, okay. So I don't accept the premise of the question. I don't accept that women are put down. I just don't accept the premise. I don't remember a lot of the premises now, but I don't accept them. So I can't really speak to that. All I can say is that I have personally found it extraordinarily liberating. It's so wonderful to be in a shul and not to have men gawking at you, and to not to have to dress in a way that would cause people to gawk at you. And there's an extraordinary amount of liberation that I experience in that. I love the fact that we have a mechitza in the shul, that you can be about the business that you came to the shul for. I love that I can go to a class and it's just for women, and I'm not dealing with any of the kind of, tension of polarity of male-female things. So yeah, I don't know if that answers it or not, but that's how I feel about being an Orthodox Jewish woman.
All right. There are no more questions coming through right now. If anyone's on Facebook, if you want to quickly send a question through, I have someone reading the Facebook questions. I want to say a couple of things. I want to say that this has been a very, very inspiring interview, because I'm inspired by your journey, but I'm also inspired by your deep faith and your deep connection, and how it's really an expression of who you are, and you've really found identity, your identity as a Jew. It's truly impressive. Someone's asking, are you a Chabadnik?
Am I a Chabadnik? I don't really know what it means to be a Chabadnik, but I very much subscribe to the Rebbe's teaching and the Alter Rebbe's teaching. I have been completely humbled by the kindness and generosity and positivity that I've experienced with Chabad emissaries around the world, in Israel, here in my community. When I go to England to visit my sister, she lives in a very Jewish area, and I go to the Chabad shul there, and I am completely blown away by what Chabad is and what it represents and what it has done for me personally. And the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's mind is just the most amazing thing I have come into contact with. The way, certainly for me, it's really been an incredible honor to read his teachings, because it's almost as though he just enters into the mind and just leads you along this incredible, glorious path of self-realization. It's totally mind-blowing. The Tanya as a work is a masterpiece. What the Alter Rebbe does with the weekly parsha in Likutei Torah and Likutei Or, in Torah Or, unbelievable. There are no words to really express what that is, because it's an experience, but it's a wellspring of beauty and divine grace that you experience when you enter in. And so, if that's what characterizes a Chabadnik, then yes, I'm a Chabadnik. I also love the way they bring up their kids, by the way. I love the hands-on of, Chabad rabbis with their kids, and just the integrity of the family is just amazing.
I have gotten a couple of questions that people are pushing, so I'm going to just answer. I think you answered them. You're not one of the Igbo tribe, is that correct?
I am one of the Igbo tribes. That's why they tried to kill us during the war. It was genocidal war. The war was fought to wipe out the Igbos. Okay.
And the second question, did you experience any anti-Semitism from Nigeria?
Well, interestingly enough, no. But there is just this idea that, Jews are stingy and are this and are that, but that's really kind of in the Catholic milieu. But I personally, have I experienced anti-Semitism? No. I do have some relatives who call me up every now and again and try to convince me that Catholicism is the way forward, but that's just what they do. I have a lot of relatives, by the way. My paternal grandfather had 50 wives or something. So I have.
Oh, really?
I have cousins.
Tell us about that. Why did he have 50 wives?
There's not really very much to tell. He was a chief, and so wives were property, and he had a lot of them, and he was very much in cahoots with the British. He didn't trust them, but he worked with the British and actually visited England himself twice at the invitation of King George VI. From what I understand, he was a very tyrannical leader. He shot himself in 1933. But the upshot of all of this is that he had a lot of kids. And so I have cousins literally all over the world. I have hundreds of cousins in the United States, for instance, so.
All right. I'm going to wrap up, but two more things. First of all, have you ever cried? This is going to be the last question, then I have a couple of things to read to you. Have you ever cried when being drawn to godliness?
When doing what?
Being drawn to godliness. Has it ever
Oh my
made you
gosh!
cry?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I have to remind myself not to cry on Shabbos, because holy smoke, the energy is so incredibly intense, and it's not tears of sorrow, but it really is overwhelming. So yeah, I cry. I might cry reading Tehillim. It's just like So yeah.
And then just two comments I want to share with you. Shoshana, you're an inspiration. Thank you for sharing your story with us. That's one comment. And the other is, I hope you're going to write a book, which I believe you said you're doing already.
I am doing that already, yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I want to invite you, once everything opens up and we're able to travel again, I'd like you to come here for a Shabbos and spend a Shabbos with our community, maybe share a little bit more about your story and your wisdom and your incredible inspiration. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. It's
really a wonderful evening. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.